Consider this official notice, Mr. Whitaker. Your cabin is reserved for the Homeowners Association retreat next month. Capacity 100 guests. Failure to comply will result in fines. Patricia Langford's voice had that smug tilt, the kind that carried across a yard even without a megaphone. She didn't hand me a letter. She pressed it against my chest like a personal insult. Behind her, the landscapers she'd dragged along pretended to examine my hedges, already measuring a space that wasn't theirs to take. I didn't even blink. That cabin isn't a community facility, Patricia, and you just reserved the one place in this neighborhood that doesn't belong to your board. My voice came out level, too, even for the grin she'd been rehearsing. Her nails clicked against the paper, but the smile faltered. I'd given her something she didn't expect, resistance grounded in fact, not fear. If you've ever felt that surge of power when standing up to bullies, hit subscribe now. This showdown is about to become a masterclass in fighting back. She tried to recover. You can't fight policy. Her tone was airy, dismissive, as if I was just another crank. But that's when I let her know she'd miscalculated. I build policy into concrete, Patricia. I'm a structural engineer. I've spent 20 years reading bylaws and city codes. You just tried to commandeer the one house in this neighborhood that predates your entire association. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. I could feel her composure slipping, and the men behind her avoided my eyes, not wanting to be caught in the middle. I glanced back at the cabin, the cedar siding, the porch swing that still creaked when the wind blew in off the lake. My wife's grandfather had built that stone fireplace by hand, and every holiday since Lily was born, we'd sat around it with hot chocolate, listening to stories that felt older than the trees. When my wife passed, the cabin became the one place where her voice still echoed. Patricia thought she was seizing a venue, but what she was actually trying to take was a family's lifeline. This isn't about a building, I said quietly. It's about memory. That fireplace behind me has stood for 3 generations. My daughter grew up in its glow. You think you're planning a weekend retreat. What you're really doing is trying to erase a legacy. Patricia snorted, as though I'd said something sentimental instead of unshakable. But I didn't waver. I'd been underestimated before. I'd been shoved into corners by people who thought control was the same thing as power, and every time, I'd found the seam in their armor. This was no different. The paper crinkled under my hand, but I didn't look down at it again. I didn't need to. I knew enough already. Patricia had walked onto my property thinking she owned it. That arrogance would be the undoing of everything she was trying to build. "Where are you watching from?" I asked, letting the words hang not for her, but for anyone who's ever faced down someone like her. Because this wasn't just my fight, it was everyone's who'd ever been told to roll over, sign the paper, and let the bully win. I stepped past her, brushing the notice back into her hands. "You've chosen the wrong man's cabin to claim, Patricia, and by the time this is over, everyone here will know just how wrong you were." I left her standing in the gravel, stunned into silence. The landscapers shuffled their boots, waiting for instructions that wouldn't come. Patricia had thrown the first stone. I was about to bring down the wall. I didn't look back as I left Patricia standing in my driveway. The paper she had shoved into my chest still crumpled under her hand, but I knew she wouldn't retreat. People like her didn't understand retreat. They only understood escalation. By the time I made it down the gravel path to the lakeside park, the consequences of her arrogance were already staring me in the face. The community bulletin board stood beside the water, glass case fogged slightly from the morning chill. A bright flyer had been pinned dead center, printed on thick cardstock as if it were already official. Across the top, bold letters announced, "Annual HOA Retreat, hosted at the Whitaker Cabin." The sight punched me in the chest harder than her notice had. Beneath it, neat bullet points promised guest capacity, catered meals, and exclusive use of the historic fireplace. They hadn't just claimed my home. They had promised my wife's hearth like it was a prop for their show. A couple of neighbors lingered nearby, reading the sheet with guarded faces. Mrs. Delgado, who always kept her roses immaculate, shifted uneasily when she noticed me. Others avoided my eyes altogether. I understood why. Patricia's reach was long. She fined people for fence height, for the color of their garden chairs, for keeping a kayak in view. They had seen what happened to those who resisted. But this was different. This wasn't a kayak or a flower bed. This was a cabin that predated every bylaw in the HOA handbook. I leaned closer and studied the language. The flyer didn't say community facility. It said Whitaker Cabin. They were using my family's name to sell legitimacy. That was a mistake. Patricia had blurred the line between what the HOA controlled and what it dreamed of controlling. I pulled out my phone and snapped photos of the flyer from every angle, careful to capture the phrasing. A couple of the neighbors noticed, shifting uncomfortably, but no one dared remove the sheet. That was the effect Patricia thrived on. Silence, compliance. Yet the silence felt different now. The hush carried weight, like the first crack in ice before the thaw. As I walked along the pier, I listened to the fragments of conversation drifting behind me. I thought it was private property. One voice whispered. Another replied, "She says it's part of the neighborhood now." I stopped mid-step. That's how it began. Rumors seeded as facts, repeated until they became gospel. If enough people believed it, even lies grew roots. Patricia knew that. She was staking her control not on law, but on perception. The water lapped softly against the posts, a sound I had grown up with. My daughter loved this pier. She used to run down it barefoot, laughing while her mother called after her. I gripped the railing and stared out across the lake. Losing the cabin would mean losing this rhythm, this soundscape stitched into our lives. Patricia wanted to turn it into background noise for her speeches. That thought made my jaw tighten. I left the pier and circled back past the playground, where children clambered over the swings and slides. Their laughter should have been pure, but even here, I caught scraps of conversation from parents clustered on benches. They were talking about the retreat, about how Patricia finally got access to that big cabin, as if it were an inevitable victory. I clenched my fists in my pockets. That's how she operated. Declare something as fact, dare anyone to contradict it, and wait for compliance to become tradition. But traditions are only as strong as the truth beneath them. And I had the truth. The cabin was mine, deeded long before the HOA existed. Patricia was bluffing on authority she didn't have. I just had to prove it in a way no one could ignore. The walk home felt heavier than it should have. I kept picturing Lily on the porch swing, sketching in her notebook like her mother once did. What would it do to her if we lost the only place where her mother's presence still lingered? The thought was unbearable. This wasn't just about property rights. This was about keeping a promise I'd made to both of them, that no one would ever take away what her grandfather had built stone by stone. By the time I reached my cabin again, Patricia was gone, but the landscapers had left faint tire tracks in the gravel, proof of her intrusion. I brushed my hand across the porch railing, steadying myself. She'd drawn first blood with her flyers. Now it was my turn to pull back the curtain on her fraud. The tire tracks were still fresh when I left the cabin again, but I didn't linger on them. I knew Patricia's next move wouldn't be made on my gravel driveway. It would be staged where she had an audience, where every raised eyebrow and nervous glance would weigh in her favor. That meant the HOA meeting room. If she was going to flaunt her authority, she'd do it there, surrounded by neighbors too tired or too intimidated to argue. The building sat at the far end of the community, a low structure with beige siding and tall windows that never seemed to let in enough light. Inside, folding chairs were set in rows, and the faint hum of a ceiling fan tried to disguise the tension already gathering in the air. Patricia stood near the front, chatting with two board members like a queen addressing her court. She didn't look at me when I walked in. That dismissal was deliberate, her way of saying she already owned the narrative. I took a seat halfway back, angled so I could watch her without appearing like I was staring. That's when I saw Evan Marshall. He sat 3 chairs from the aisle, stiff posture, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. His eyes flicked toward Patricia and then away, like someone caught between duty and conscience. I'd seen enough micro-expressions in my line of work to know a man torn in two. Patricia called the meeting to order with her usual rehearsed cheer. "Community spirit is everything," she began, her tone syrupy. She rattled off agenda items about landscaping and parking enforcement before sliding smoothly into her prize announcement. "And this year, we're proud to host our annual retreat at the Whitaker Cabin, a facility we can all enjoy together." The word facility hit me like a slap. My jaw tightened, but I stayed still. Across the room, Evan shifted. He adjusted his tie, though it wasn't crooked, then rubbed the back of his neck. His foot tapped against the floor, a rhythm out of sync with Patricia's polished speech. The man looked like he wanted to stand but couldn't get his body to obey. I leaned forward slightly, studying him. He wouldn't meet my eyes, but the twitch in his shoulders told me he felt them. Patricia was blind to his unrest. She basked in the nods of a few neighbors, pretending the silence of the rest was consent. But I saw something she didn't, a fault line running right through her support system. When she passed out sheets with retreat details, I made sure to take one. The wording was even bolder than the flyer. Cabin designated for association event. No conditional language, no acknowledgement of ownership, just a declaration, as if saying it enough times would make it true. I folded the sheet slowly, my eyes sliding back to Evan. His hand trembled slightly as he accepted his copy. He cleared his throat, started to raise a finger, then dropped it back into his lap. His lips parted once, then pressed tight again. Anyone else might have missed it, but to me, it was as clear as a blueprint. A man fighting an internal war. Patricia's voice droned on about catering and seating arrangements. The room buzzed with passive acceptance, but every time she said, "our cabin," Evan's body betrayed him. His knee jerked, his jaw clenched, his fingers tightened around the paper until it wrinkled. He wasn't with her, not fully. He was trapped in her shadow, but the shadow was thinning. When the meeting adjourned, Patricia swept out in a wave of perfume and command. Most neighbors filed out quietly, heads down. Evan lingered. He smoothed his paper, then folded it with careful precision, as if buying himself time. I walked past him toward the door, close enough to catch the faint hitch of his breath. He still didn't speak, but he didn't need to. I'd seen enough in the set of his shoulders and the restless shift of his eyes. Evan Marshall was conflicted, and in that conflict, I saw my first real advantage. Evan's silence followed me out of that room like an echo I couldn't shake. He hadn't spoken a word, but his body had screamed louder than anything Patricia announced. That fracture in her circle gave me hope, but hope alone wasn't going to stop her. The next morning, I found out just how far she was willing to go. I woke to the sound of engines outside my cabin, tires grinding over gravel, doors slamming, voices muffled but purposeful. When I stepped onto the porch, the sight made my blood boil. 2 landscaping trucks idled in my driveway, their trailers stacked with tools. Men in bright vests unloaded rakes and hedge trimmers like they were setting up for an official project. Patricia stood near the porch steps, clipboard in hand, her expression smug. "Morning, Daniel," she called brightly, as though we were neighbors sharing coffee. "We're prepping the grounds for the retreat. Your cabin needs to look its best for 100 guests." She tapped the clipboard, signaling she thought she was untouchable. I moved down the steps, gravel crunching under my boots. "You're trespassing. These men have no right to touch my property." My voice came out low, tight, the kind of tone I used in inspections when someone tried to cut corners on safety. Patricia didn't flinch. She gestured to the lawn like a stage manager preparing for opening night. "It's all covered under community beautification. You wouldn't want your place to look neglected in front of everyone, would you?" She smiled, saccharine sweet, but her eyes stayed cold. The landscapers hesitated, tools in hand, waiting to see which authority mattered more, her clipboard or my ownership. I stepped closer, letting my shadow cut across Patricia's shoes. "This cabin isn't on your HOA rolls, Patricia. You can dress it up with flyers and speeches, but the law doesn't change because you print it on paper." Her smirk twitched, but she recovered quickly. "You'll find the fines stacking fast if you refuse. Non-compliance isn't an option." She turned, snapping her fingers at the men. "Trim the hedges, start with the front." That's when I raised my phone. The screen glowed as I hit record, my voice calm and steady. "Patricia Langford, HOA Vice President, directing trespassers onto private property without consent. Consider this your notice that you're violating state property law." I made sure my voice carried. The landscapers froze, eyes wide, tools dangling uselessly. None of them wanted to be caught on video doing illegal work. Patricia's mask cracked, her cheeks flushed, and her hand tightened on the clipboard until the plastic creaked. "You think filming me changes anything?" she snapped, but her voice had lost its shine. She turned on the workers, her command sharp now instead of sweet. "Back to the trucks. We'll handle this later." They didn't need telling twice. Tools clattered back into trailers, doors slammed, engines roared to life. Within minutes, the trucks pulled away, leaving tire grooves across my gravel drive. Patricia lingered a moment longer, glaring at me like she could burn through my resolve. "You're making this harder on yourself," she said finally. "You'll regret it." Then she marched off, heels striking the gravel like gunshots. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the wind stirring the pines. I lowered the phone, saving the recording. It wasn't much, but it was proof. Proof she was overreaching, stepping onto ground she didn't control. Proof I could use later when the time came to expose her. I stood in the yard, looking at the faint lines her landscapers had left in the gravel. They were tracks of intrusion, but also of desperation. Patricia thought she could bluff her way into ownership by acting as though it were already hers. But every overstep was ammunition. Every attempt to enforce her false authority would stack against her. The cabin loomed behind me, solid, unshaken. The stone fireplace inside still held the memory of the family who built it. Patricia might see walls and square footage, but I saw legacy. And I wasn't going to let her strip that away under the banner of community. As I walked back up the steps, the wood creaked under my boots, grounding me. Patricia had escalated, yes, but escalation always left footprints, and I was ready to follow them straight to the crack in her authority. The porch boards still groaned under my boots when I sat at the kitchen table later that evening. Patricia's threats rang in my ears, but the recording on my phone gave me a sense of quiet satisfaction. Proof mattered, but proof alone wouldn't win. I knew she'd escalate again, and if I didn't have something stronger than video evidence, she'd bury me under fines and paperwork until exhaustion did her work for her. I spread the latest violation notices across the table. 3 envelopes, all stamped with the HOA's seal, all claiming non-compliance. One accused me of refusing grounds maintenance. Another labeled me obstructive to community planning. The third demanded payment for special event preparation. I turned them over, rereading the language, letting my engineer's mind slow the words down until patterns began to show. Patricia's strength had always been confidence, but confidence is a mask. Underneath it, she was sloppy. I circled a phrase in the second notice. As a community facility, your property falls under mandatory scheduling compliance. My pen hovered over those words. Facility, not residence, not privately owned dwelling. Facility. She had shifted the language. I flipped back through earlier letters from months ago. There it was again, creeping into her vocabulary like a weed. Patricia was rewriting my cabin's identity, not just in flyers, but in official notices. I leaned back, staring at the cedar beams overhead. She wasn't just overstepping, she was staking her entire claim on a clause that never applied to me. In bylaws, the difference between residence and facility was everything. I'd spent years reviewing contracts on job sites, catching misused phrases that could topple an entire building permit. I knew how words held weight, and here, Patricia had tripped into the one arena where I couldn't be outmatched. I gathered every notice into a neat stack, arranging them by date. The pattern was clear now. Early letters had treated my cabin like private property. But once Patricia's ambition turned toward the retreat, the language shifted. She had crossed a line from enforcement into fabrication. I could feel my pulse steadying as I traced the trajectory. She thought she was untouchable, but words leave trails. The room grew quiet, except for the tick of the old wall clock. I looked out the kitchen window toward the lake, where the water glimmered in the fading light. My wife used to sit at this very table, sorting recipes or helping Lily with homework while I studied structural codes for city projects. She always joked that I could catch a misplaced comma faster than anyone she knew. It had seemed like a quirk back then. Now it felt like a weapon. I opened my laptop and pulled up the HOA bylaws, the same ones Patricia claimed to enforce. The document was long, bloated with amendments, but I knew how to scan for weak joints. Section 4.3 caught my eye. Common facilities shall be defined as areas deeded to the association by majority owner approval. I read it twice, then again. My cabin wasn't listed. It never had been. The deed dated decades before the HOA's incorporation. Patricia's claim had no anchor. I highlighted the clause, saving a copy. The realization tightened my chest, not with fear, but with certainty. I had my opening. Patricia had built her siege on sand, and the tide was coming in. The door creaked as Lily stepped in from the porch, sketchbook tucked under her arm. "Dad, why were those trucks here today?" Her voice carried a mix of suspicion and unease. She was too sharp not to notice. I reached over, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Because some people think they can take what isn't theirs. But they don't know this cabin's history. They don't know it belongs to you as much as it does to me." Her eyes softened, and she nodded slowly. She didn't need more detail than that. Not yet. But seeing her there reminded me exactly why I couldn't back down. Patricia thought this was a property dispute. She didn't understand it was a promise. The papers lay spread out across the table, glowing under the warm kitchen light. I tapped the circled phrase again, facility, and slid the notices into a folder. This was more than sloppy wording. This was the thread that could unravel Patricia's entire web of control, and I intended to pull it. The folder sat on the kitchen table like a loaded weapon. Inside it, Patricia's own words betrayed her. Each misuse of facility, another crack in her armor. I knew what it meant. But proving it to the community was going to take more than a folder of notices. Patricia controlled perception, and perception in a neighborhood like ours was almost as dangerous as law. The next morning, I walked down to the lakeside pier for some air. The sun was just beginning to rise, washing the water in gold. A group of neighbors had gathered near the benches, sipping coffee from travel mugs. Their voices carried easily across the quiet lake, and I caught my name more than once. "Whitaker's being difficult again," one man said. He shook his head, like I was a stubborn child. "Patricia says the cabin was always supposed to serve the community." "That's not what I heard," another replied. "Didn't his wife's family build that place before the HOA even existed?" A third voice chimed in, softer, uncertain. "Well, Patricia posted the notices. It must be official." I froze, standing just far enough back that they didn't notice me. My stomach knotted, not from fear but from urgency. Patricia's bluff was working. She didn't need the law on her side if she convinced enough people it already was. If neighbors believed her flyers and her speeches, the truth wouldn't matter. Perception would become reality. I leaned against the railing, listening to the water slap gently against the posts. The sound that once brought me peace now carried the weight of a warning. My daughter loved this pier. She used to sit cross-legged at the edge, toes dangling just above the surface, sketching the boats that drifted by. If Patricia turned the cabin into a community hall, those sketches would become memories of something stolen. The thought hardened something in me. This wasn't just about property anymore. This was about protecting the one place where Lily could still feel her mother's presence. Patricia's attempt to rewrite the cabin's identity wasn't a simple violation. It was an erasure, and I wasn't going to let it happen. Drop a like if you've ever wanted to stand up to unreasonable rules like this, and subscribe to see how this strategy plays out. I turned and walked back toward the path, the gravel crunching beneath my boots. The conversations trailed off behind me, but the damage was done. Patricia had planted the seed, and the roots were spreading. If I didn't act soon, her story would drown mine out completely. By the time I reached the end of the pier, my decision was made. I couldn't sit back and wait for her to tighten her grip. I had to act before the retreat date loomed too close, before the community resigned itself to her version of events. The path wound past the playground, where children's laughter rang out as they clambered over slides and swings. Their parents chatted quietly on the benches, and I noticed one of them holding a folded retreat flyer. The sight hit me like a punch. Patricia's narrative was everywhere, woven into casual conversations, passed around like gospel. I clenched my jaw and walked faster. If Patricia wanted to win by perception, then I needed to beat her by truth. And truth required timing. The bylaws were clear. Common facilities required majority owner approval and deed transfer. My cabin had neither. Patricia's power was smoke. All I had to do was bring in enough light to show the illusion for what it was. By the time I reached my driveway, the plan was already forming. I couldn't expose her yet. I didn't have enough witnesses. But I could prepare. Every notice, every flyer, Every overheard word on that pier had to be documented, aligned, and cross-referenced against the bylaws. When the moment came, I would present it all in one strike. I looked back toward the lake, where the morning sun glimmered off the water. My wife had always said I could find structure in chaos, patterns in noise. She was right, and now I had no choice but to use that skill to protect what she left behind. Patricia thought this was just a battle over space. She didn't realize she had forced me into a corner where I had nothing left to lose. And a man with nothing left to lose is the one most dangerous to corner. I stood in the driveway staring at the lake, the sunlight reflecting so bright it stung my eyes. The folder of notices sat under my arm, heavy with possibility. Patricia's bluff was spreading through conversations and flyers like wildfire, but I had a plan now. All I needed was leverage strong enough to expose her in one strike. What I didn't expect was that the first spark of that leverage would come from Evan Marshall. It was just after dusk when I heard a hesitant knock at the door. I opened it to find Evan standing there, shoulders tight, eyes darting toward the gravel road like he was afraid Patricia herself might appear. He held no clipboard, no papers, just his own unease. "Can we talk?" His voice was low, almost swallowed by the chirp of crickets along the tree line. I stepped aside and let him in. He hovered just inside the doorway, shifting his weight like every board in my cabin was judging him. His hands worked against each other, wringing invisible water from his fingers. "You don't have to look so nervous," I said, setting the folder on the table. "I'm not the one you're betraying." His flinch told me I'd struck the right nerve. He walked to the edge of the living room, his eyes flicking toward the stone fireplace before he spoke. "Patricia, she's not following the rules, not even close." His throat bobbed, and he glanced at the door again. "She's been filing board decisions without votes. Minutes don't match what actually happened in the meetings." The admission hung between us like a loose beam. He shifted again, one hand dragging down his tie, though he wasn't even wearing one tonight. It was a habit, a tell of a man caught between truth and loyalty. I leaned forward on the table. "So, you've known she's been lying to the community?" He pressed his lips together, eyes dropping to the floorboards. "I tried to keep the peace. She's family, my brother's wife. But it's gone too far. This retreat, she doesn't have the authority. The board never approved it." He rubbed his palms against his thighs, restless energy spilling out in every gesture. "She drafts the motions herself, then writes them into the minutes like they passed." That was it. The confession I needed. Patricia wasn't just bluffing with flyers and notices. She was fabricating authority outright. And Evan, with his hunched shoulders and a voice that cracked under the weight of guilt, had just given me the proof behind the pattern. I let the silence stretch until he finally looked up at me. His eyes carried both shame and relief, the weight of a man tired of carrying a secret that had soured in his chest. "You came here because you want this to stop," I said quietly. He nodded, quick, almost desperate. "Yes, but you can't let her know it came from me. She'd ruin me." His fingers tapped against his leg, a staccato rhythm of fear. "But the county keeps records of incorporation. If you pull them, you'll see. The cabin deed isn't listed. It predates all of this. Patricia knows it, but she thinks no one will check." I felt the shift then, the way I had during inspections when one misplaced beam revealed the entire flaw of a building. Patricia had built her control on falsified votes and rewritten language. And Evan, trembling in my living room, had just handed me the key to unlock it all. "You've done the right thing," I told him. His shoulders sagged, a visible weight sliding off him. "I just want to live in a neighborhood that isn't run on fear." He glanced toward the fireplace again, eyes softening. "And your wife's family built something here worth protecting. Don't let her tear it down." When he left, the night air rushed back into the cabin, carrying the smell of pine and the faint ripple of the lake. I picked up the folder again, the pages suddenly lighter. Evan's confession changed everything. I didn't just have misused words, I had testimony, a direct crack in Patricia's authority. Patricia had forced me into a corner, but corners have edges, and I was ready to cut. When the door shut behind Evan, I stood in the quiet cabin, staring at the folder on the table. His words still echoed. "She drafts the motions herself, then writes them into the minutes like they passed." It was the missing piece I needed. Patricia wasn't just overreaching, she was fabricating authority from nothing. And if I could show that, her entire case against me would collapse. The next morning, I didn't stay home. Instead, I drove into town and headed straight for my office. My workplace wasn't glamorous, just a modest engineering firm tucked between a bank and a diner. But it had something Patricia hadn't considered: access to county records and the kind of technical resources that left no room for lies. I unlocked the glass door and stepped inside. The scent of drafting paper and machine oil clung to the air. Blueprints lined the walls, each one stamped and cataloged with precision. My desk sat in the corner, stacked with rolled plans and binders full of code references. Here, I wasn't just a homeowner fighting fines. Here, I was the man who spent decades turning words on paper into steel and stone. I opened my laptop and pulled up the county's online archive. The system wasn't elegant, but I knew how to navigate it. Years of combing through permits and compliance documents had trained my eye to spot the smallest discrepancies. I typed in Whitaker Cabin and waited. The result appeared within seconds. Deed filed in 1962, well before the HOA's incorporation in 1989. I leaned back, letting the weight of that fact settle over me. The cabin wasn't under their jurisdiction. It never had been. But I didn't stop there. I searched the HOA's articles of incorporation, scanning the dense legal text for mention of common facilities. The bylaws repeated what I'd already found. Common facilities must be deeded by majority approval. I searched again, cross-referencing amendments. Nowhere, absolutely nowhere, did my cabin appear. Patricia's flyers were pure invention. I printed the deed record and the incorporation filing, laying them side by side on my desk. The contrast was stark. My deed stood on its own, solid, untouched for decades. The HOA's authority began years later, limited to parcels willingly given over. There was no overlap. Patricia's entire scheme rested on smoke and mirrors. Still, I needed more. Evan's confession gave me the knowledge that minutes were falsified, but I needed evidence to back it. I dug through the county clerk system again, this time looking at HOA filings. Meeting minutes submitted for the past year were short, vague, and unsigned. That alone raised a red flag. Proper filings required signatures from voting board members, but these carried only Patricia's initials. The picture was becoming clear. Patricia had been doctoring the minutes, submitting them without proper approval. She hadn't just overstepped, she'd broken the law. I gathered every printout, sliding them into a fresh binder. My hand brushed over the cool plastic cover, and I felt a surge of control I hadn't known in weeks. This wasn't guesswork anymore. This was evidence. Evidence that could withstand scrutiny. Evidence that could flip perception in an instant. As I organized the documents, I thought of Lily. She'd grown quiet since Patricia's. Harassment began, watching me juggle notices and confrontations like a storm cloud that never moved. I wanted her to see me win this, not just for the cabin, but to know that bullies could be beaten when you fought with truth. By the time the sun dipped low outside the office windows, the binder was full. Deed copies, incorporation filings, misused language from violation letters, and notes of Evan's testimony. Each piece alone might raise doubt. Together, they formed a wall Patricia couldn't climb. I closed the binder with a firm snap. Patricia thought she could control this neighborhood with intimidation and lies. What she didn't understand was that lies collapse under the weight of records, and intimidation shrinks when the law shines on it. Tomorrow, I'd take this binder back to the neighborhood, not to reveal it yet, but to prepare for the moment the whole community would be watching. Because when I struck, it had to be public, it had to be undeniable, and it had to end her grip on us all. The binder felt heavier than its weight as I carried it out of the office the next morning. Every page inside was a nail for Patricia's coffin. Deed dates, incorporation filings, bylaws she had ignored, and Evan's whispered confession. But I wasn't naive. Evidence like this meant nothing if it stayed locked in my hands. It had to be gathered, secured, and verified by someone outside Patricia's shadow. That meant the county clerk's office. The building sat on Main Street, a square brick structure with fading paint, and a flag out front that snapped in the morning wind. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old paper, and the low hum of fluorescent lights echoed against the tiled floors. I'd been here before for permits, for compliance checks, but this time was different. This time, I wasn't here as an engineer. I was here as a man defending his family's legacy. I approached the records desk, where a clerk with glasses perched low on his nose looked up from a ledger. "Morning. What can I help you find?" I slid the binder onto the counter and opened it to the deed record. "I need confirmation. This cabin deed was filed in 1962. Yes?" The clerk adjusted his glasses, leaning over the page. He nodded. "That's right. Long before your HOA incorporation date." I tapped the second document. And under county law, a facility must be deeded over by majority approval to fall under HOA control. Can you confirm no such deed exists for the Whitaker cabin? He typed into the computer, the keys clacking in quick succession. After a few minutes, he shook his head. "No record of transfer. Cabin remains private property. HOA has no standing over it." Relief flooded through me, steady and grounding. It wasn't just my interpretation anymore. It was confirmed, stamped in the county's own system. But I didn't stop there. I asked for certified copies, official seals that would speak louder than Patricia's flyers. The clerk printed them, pressing the embossed stamp firmly into the corner. The paper bore authority she couldn't counterfeit, authority that would silence rumors and shatter her narrative. As I gathered the documents, Evan's words returned. "She's been filing board decisions without votes." That was the second half of the trap. I requested recent HOA filings too, specifically minutes from the past year. The clerk retrieved them from the archive, a thin stack of papers that felt almost flimsy in my hands. Each one bore Patricia's initials alone. No signatures from other board members, no proof of actual votes. They looked official at first glance, but to anyone who understood procedure, they screamed fraud. I slipped the filings into the binder beside the certified deed copies. The contrast was striking. Real authority pressed in ink versus Patricia's self-made authority built on initials and lies. Walking out of the clerk's office, the morning sun hit my face, and for the first time in weeks, I felt taller. Patricia thought she had me cornered. She didn't realize I had just assembled the walls of my own defense and her downfall. On the way back, I stopped by Evan's house. His yard was quiet, the porch light still on, though it was daylight. He answered the door with the same nervous energy he carried everywhere now, glancing up and down the street before letting me inside. I set the binder on his kitchen table, flipping it open to the certified deed copy. His eyes widened, his fingers brushing the embossed seal. "So it's true," he murmured. "She never had any authority over it." "Not a shred," I confirmed. "And these—" I tapped the stack of falsified minutes. "Show she's been running this board with nothing but her signature." Evan exhaled, shoulders sagging. "If you show this at the meeting, she won't survive it." "That's the plan," I said. "But it has to be public. The whole community needs to hear it at once. If I bring this to Patricia privately, she'll bury it under more lies. But in front of everyone, she won't be able to recover." He nodded slowly, a flicker of resolve replacing his fear. "I'll back you up. I should have spoken sooner, but I'll speak then." I closed the binder and lifted it from the table. The weight felt lighter now, balanced by certainty. Patricia had taken the first swing, but I was ready to end the fight. And when the next board meeting came, the entire community would see the truth laid bare. I left Evan's house with the binder tucked under my arm, its edges pressing firm against my side like armor. The plan was set now. The truth would be revealed where Patricia could no longer twist it, under the bright lights of the HOA's own board meeting. But that didn't mean she was standing still. By the time I reached the HOA office later that week, her fingerprints were everywhere. The office sat at the center of the neighborhood, glass-fronted and manicured, like a showroom for control. A banner stretched across the entrance, "Community Retreat, 1 week away." It showed a stylized cabin drawn in cheerful colors, complete with the outline of a stone fireplace. She had turned my home into marketing material, plastered on every flyer, every email, and now across the very building where decisions were made. I walked inside. The air smelled faintly of fresh paint and printer toner, too polished to be welcoming. Patricia stood behind the counter, clipboard in hand, chatting with a resident about seating arrangements. Her voice carried easily, confident and warm, the kind of performance she wore like a second skin. But when her eyes flicked up and met mine, the mask cracked for just a breath. "Mr. Whitaker," she said smoothly, her smile tightening at the corners, "here to finally sign the compliance forms?" I stepped closer, letting the binder rest visibly in my hand. "Number? I'm here to make sure this retreat of yours doesn't happen." My tone was steady, but my words landed like stone. Her smile didn't falter, but the color in her cheeks deepened. "You really should reconsider. Fighting the board won't end well for you." She tapped her pen against the clipboard, sharp, deliberate. "Non-compliance fines will only pile higher." I leaned across the counter, lowering my voice just enough for her to feel the weight of it. "You've been running this board on signatures that don't exist, and next week I'm going to show everyone exactly how you've done it." For a fraction of a second, the veneer slipped. Her fingers stilled on the clipboard, her jaw tightened. But just as quickly, she smoothed it away, tilting her head in false sympathy. "Empty threats won't save you, Daniel. The retreat is happening, and your cabin will host it. Everyone's looking forward to it." I turned, ignoring the residents who lingered nearby, watching with cautious eyes. They had heard her version long enough. Soon, they'd hear mine. Outside, the autumn air bit colder than before. I sat on the stone bench just beyond the office, the banner overhead fluttering with the wind. From where I sat, I could see neighbors passing by, some carrying groceries, others walking dogs, each one glancing toward the banner as though it were fact carved in stone. Patricia had sold them a story. I had 1 week to prove it was fiction. I pulled the binder onto my lap, flipping it open to the certified deed copy. The embossed seal glinted in the light, an anchor against Patricia's storm. I rehearsed in my head how I'd present it. Start with the deed predating the HOA, then show the bylaws requiring majority transfer, then reveal the falsified minutes. Piece by piece, the illusion would collapse. By the time I finished, even Patricia's strongest supporters wouldn't be able to defend her. But evidence wasn't the only thing I needed. I needed presence. Calm, steady, undeniable presence. Patricia thrived. On spectacle. On making herself the loudest voice in the room. If I wanted to defeat her, I couldn't just out-argue her. I had to outlast her. The wind tugged at the banner above the HOA office, snapping it loud enough to draw stares. I looked up at the cheerful drawing of my cabin, its fireplace rendered in cartoon lines. It almost made me laugh. Patricia thought she'd claimed the heart of this neighborhood. What she didn't realize was that the heart wasn't made of cartoon sketches or glossy flyers. It was made of stone, laid by hand decades ago. And it would outlast her just like it had outlasted storms before her. I stood, tucking the binder back under my arm. The next board meeting would be the stage. I'd bring the truth. Evan would bring his voice, and Patricia would finally face the weight of the law she pretended to wield. As I walked home, the banner flapped behind me, bright and bold. Soon, it would hang as nothing more than a relic of her arrogance. The night of the board meeting arrived colder than expected. Clouds pressed low over the lake, and the glow from the community hall spilled onto the pavement like a stage light. Inside, the room was packed. Folding chairs filled every corner, neighbors standing shoulder to shoulder along the walls. Patricia had made sure of that. She wanted an audience to watch her triumph. What she didn't realize was that she had built the stage for her downfall. The banner advertising the retreat hung behind the board table, a cartoon image of my cabin smiling down on the crowd. Patricia sat at the center, flanked by 2 board members who looked more tired than loyal. She wore her usual polished smile, clipboard in hand, her nails clicking against it like drum beats. The sound carried across the hall as she leaned into the microphone. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice bright and rehearsed. "This year's retreat at the Whitaker cabin is going to be a turning point for our community. We're setting new standards, and we're proving what can be done when neighbors come together." Applause rippled through the room, some enthusiastic, some hesitant. I watched from my seat near the front, binder resting on my lap. My pulse thudded steady, not from fear, but from the knowledge that once I opened this binder, everything changed. Patricia motioned toward me, her smile sharpened with smugness. "Of course, not everyone has been cooperative. Mr. Whitaker has resisted compliance, as you all know. But rules exist for the good of the whole." She paused for effect, letting the crowd murmur. "Tonight, I'll be filing notice of fines exceeding $3,000. Non-compliance carries consequences. That was my cue. I rose slowly, binder in hand, and walked to the microphone. The room stilled, a sea of eyes following me. Patricia's smile tightened, but she didn't stop me. She wanted the crowd to watch me stumble. I opened the binder and held up the first page. Patricia Langford has told you my cabin is a community facility. She's printed it on flyers, plastered it on banners, and repeated it until some of you believe it. But here's the truth. I lifted the certified deed, the embossed seal catching the overhead light. This cabin was deeded to my wife's family in 1962. The HOA wasn't even formed until 1989. It was never transferred, never deeded, never listed as common property, which means it is private, and it always has been. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Patricia leaned forward, lips parting in protest. But I raised the second page. Section 4.3 of your own bylaws states that common facilities must be deeded to the association by majority approval. Show me one record of that approval. You can't, because it doesn't exist. The murmurs grew louder, faces shifting from confusion to realization. I flipped to the next set of documents, Patricia's falsified minutes. And here's why you were all fooled. For the last year, Patricia has filed board minutes with only her initials. No votes, no signatures, no authority. She didn't just misinterpret the rules, she fabricated them. Gasps filled the room. A man in the back stood, craning his neck to see. A woman near the front whispered sharply to her husband. The crowd was no longer with her. They were with the truth now in my hands. Patricia slammed her clipboard on the table, the sound cracking like a gunshot. "That's enough! You're twisting facts!" Before she could finish, another voice cut through the room. Evan rose from his chair near the aisle, his face pale but resolute. "No, he isn't. I was there." Patricia filed motions without votes. She wrote decisions the board never approved. I stayed quiet too long, but tonight I won't. He's telling the truth. The room erupted. Conversations overlapped, neighbors turning to one another, voices climbing. Patricia's face drained of color, her hands gripping the edge of the table like it might keep her steady. I let the noise swell before I spoke again. "You wanted a retreat at my cabin, Patricia. What you'll get instead is a record of your misconduct filed with the county tomorrow morning. The lies stop here." Applause broke out, loud and uncontainable this time. Some stood, clapping with relief as though a weight had been lifted. Patricia's children, sitting near the back, looked down at their laps, tears brimming in their eyes. The board chair, finally breaking his silence, cleared his throat. "Effective immediately, the motion to use the Whitaker cabin is void, and we'll be voting on Patricia's removal tonight." The cheer that followed shook the hall. Patricia sat frozen, her clipboard useless in her hands. I closed the binder with a snap, the sound echoing over the noise. The stage she built for triumph had become the platform for her undoing. The sound of applause still echoed in my ears as I stepped out of the community hall, into the cold night air. Behind me, neighbors lingered in clusters, their voices animated with relief and disbelief. For weeks, Patricia had convinced them the retreat at my cabin was a done deal. In less than an hour, the illusion collapsed. Truth has a way of doing that. It doesn't shout, it doesn't bully. It simply stands, and bullies crumble when the ground beneath them disappears. I walked home along the gravel path, binder still tucked under my arm, though it felt lighter now. The same neighbors who once avoided my eyes gave nods of acknowledgement as I passed. A few even whispered thanks. Their faces carried something I hadn't seen in a long time. Hope that maybe this neighborhood could belong to them again, not just to Patricia's clipboard. When I reached the cabin, the porch light glowed warm against the dark. Lily was waiting on the steps, sketchbook in her lap. She looked up, her eyes wide with the unspoken question. I sat beside her, the binder resting between us. "It's over," I told her softly. "They tried to take it, but they couldn't. This cabin is ours, and it always will be." Her shoulders relaxed, and she leaned against me, silent but steady. The fireplace inside glowed faintly through the window, its light flickering across the wood-paneled walls. That fireplace had been built by hands long gone, but tonight it burned brighter because we had kept it safe. The following morning, I filed the binder with the county clerk. certified copies, sworn statements, falsified minutes. Every piece of Patricia's fraud now existed in official records. She couldn't erase it with charm or intimidation. By the time I returned to the neighborhood, word had already spread. Patricia had been formally censured, stripped of her position, and barred from holding office again. I stood at the edge of the lake later that evening, watching the water ripple in the breeze. The pier stretched out before me, the same pier where I had overheard neighbors doubting me, the same pier where I realized her lies were spreading faster than truth. Now, the conversations were different. Parents watched their kids play without whispering about fines. Couples strolled without glancing nervously over their shoulders. The silence Patricia once commanded was gone. And Evan, well, Evan walked a little straighter. At the next meeting, he stepped forward and apologized to the community. He admitted what Patricia had done and what he had allowed by staying quiet too long. It didn't erase his silence, but it began to rebuild trust. Sometimes courage doesn't roar. Sometimes it stumbles, then steadies itself. I respected him for that. The victory wasn't just mine. It belonged to everyone who'd ever felt cornered in their own neighborhood, who'd paid fines they didn't deserve, or swallowed frustration to avoid retaliation. By standing up, I hadn't just protected my cabin. I'd cracked Patricia's stranglehold on the entire community. That night, I sat by the stone fireplace with Lily. The flames danced over the stones, casting long shadows across the cabin floor. I traced one of the rocks with my finger, remembering how her grandfather had set it in place with nothing more than his hands and determination. Generations had built this cabin, and now one more generation knew what it meant to protect it. If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now. Share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from. The fire popped, sending a spark upward. I leaned back, the warmth of the flames and the weight of the victory settling into me. Patricia had chosen the wrong cabin to claim, the wrong family to intimidate. And tonight, as the lake outside stilled under the moonlight, I knew this place would remain ours, not because of bylaws or deeds, but because we fought for it and won.